Hi, I'm Anderson Brown. I want to talk to you today about something that's been kind of bugging me for a long time, which is the issue of the alleged skepticism of David Hume. For a long time, I have the book here. Let me show it to you just for a little visual aid. This book, epistemology textbook by Robert Audi, very distinguished philosopher, and where I am teaching here at the University of Puerto Rico. For a couple times, I used that textbook for the epistemology seminar. And it seemed to me as if in that book, Robert Audi was characterizing David Hume as a skeptic. And I've gone back now and looked at it. I think, in fairness to Audi, he says that Hume brings up the notion of the problem of induction that I'm going to talk about in this video. Um, but there was some language that pretty clearly suggested that we were to take Hume as part of the sort of skeptical tendency. The Hume's empiricism was a kind of skeptical idea. I think we're all familiar with the basic notion. It's a Cartesian notion that you've got sort of the mental representation and then the external world. And that's why you're a skeptic, right? According to Descartes, because you don't know what the connection is between those two things. But in the case of Hume, I didn't think that was right. And when I saw that in this major epistemology textbook by Robert Audi, the language clearly was sort of at least implying that Hume was a skeptic, treating Hume as a kind of skeptic. And just thought that was wrong. So then what happened was that the other day I was fooling around with the chatbot AI, just asking one of the new versions of the chatbot technology of philosophical questions. And so I thought I'd ask it about this question and ask it if Hume was a skeptic, and the chatbot was all in for Hume being a skeptic. The chatbot, which, by the way, I mean, just for the record, I mean, what the chatbot does is it just goes and looks at lots and lots of text. And so it's really just reflecting the human artifact, the human culture, what human people believe. That's why, for example, there's a problem with the chatbots coming up with racist and other kinds of prejudice things, because again, it's just reflecting this raw material that it's gathering. So I was really struck by how much the chatbot AI would report to anyone who asked, oh yes, David Hume is definitely a skeptic. So it was that thing that motivated me. And then I still had that old worry about the language in the Audi textbook. And so I really thought I needed to do this one, which is Hume is not a skeptic, some very basic epistemology, because I do think that this is very important. Why is it important? One of the things, as an old dog philosophy teacher, I can tell you is that a lot of people have the idea that philosophy is an area where nothing really changes. There's always the same problems. No progress is made. I would throw in as an aside there that it's not clear to me that philosophy necessarily is always working on problems or trying to solve things. I think philosophy is a kind of literature as well as other things. But in any event, one of the things that people will always say, getting to these general perceptions, is that skepticism in particular is one of those problems that has always been there for thousands of years, is what people will say, and there's never any change. That's really, in the case of skepticism, actually not really at all true. Skepticism, as we experience it today, or as we experience it, as we talk about it in philosophy today, is mostly due to the rationalism, the rationalist movement of the 17th century, in particular Descartes' book, The Meditations, which was published in the 1640s. And not only that, but skepticism as a philosophical problem, I think it was really scarcely of just about 100 years later with David Hume, who's publishing his treatise in the 1730s, and then the inquiries not long after, that we get what is really, to me, a really quite persuasive and coherent critique of criticism, of skepticism, and certainly in the 20th century. And I'm going to get to these arguments too. I think we have arguments, empiricist arguments, that I think are they're persuasive to me that the problem of skepticism is solved. So I would argue that the problem of skepticism, as we talk about in, say, Intro to Philosophy class, is something that came up in the 17th century, And it was actually, we had the tools to show the problem by 100 years later, the 18th century. So again, some very basic epistemology, and not understanding Hume, thinking that he's a skeptic, as I'll show you now in this video right now, I think it gets really in the way of understanding what empiricism in general is really all about. So, okay, if you're teaching the history of early modern philosophy, a really basic way to do that is between the sort of 17th century rationalists and the 18th century empiricists, between the Baroque period and the Enlightenment period. And the idea is that it's about epistemology, that the rationalists think that you have to have logical proof of something. After all, Descartes is a mathematician, and that the empiricists deny that. Although in terms of early modern philosophy classes, sometimes that's a little too formulaic. Nonetheless, that distinction, I think, is a real and valid one that's still reflected in a lot of areas even today. Let's go through this slide. I think this is probably the most basic thing. As to the first bullet point there, Descartes is a mathematician. For various reasons, philosophy is very interested in the history of philosophy. We do have a history of mathematics course on my campus, but mathematicians, we're not so keyed into the history of math, are we? Descartes really a mathematician. I mean, if we had to explain what he was, I think I would describe Aristotle as a biologist. A lot of these people who come to us through the literature as canonical philosophers were people who had their own specialties. And again, in the case of Descartes, he really did, not only was he a mathematician, but he made important contributions to mathematics as well. And so it's not surprising, since Descartes is a mathematician, that he has a mathematician's notion of proof, of certainty. Certainty is certainty to a probability of 1 for Descartes, that you've demonstrated the logical necessity of the proposition is usually what we're thinking about, or of the state of affairs in the real world. Spinoza, of course, also another 17th century rationalist, who thought that every state of affairs, everything that was true about the world was true by logical necessity. Rationalism, right? Thinking about the relationship between God and nature is one of the things these people are doing. It's a very interesting period of philosophy. In any event, Descartes says, as in a calculus or a symbolic logic proof, you get the given propositions and you follow the rules, and you show that the conclusion follows necessarily from the concluding proposition follows necessarily from the propositions that preceded it. And of course, in a proof, this is all about the logical or mathematical relationships between these propositions. That's what's being shown. Formal proofs of math and logic, it's analytic. That is, the two sides sort of mean the same thing. This is an issue that both Hume and Kant get into quite a lot, if that sounds interesting. But in any event, we're trying to keep things pretty simple here. Look, Descartes says, you don't know anything unless you can show that it's logically necessary. And then he concludes, as one would in the Descartes, in the Meditations, that he doesn't really know much of anything at all. Meanwhile, second bullet point on the slide, Hume defines knowledge as conditioned expectation. Future events will share the regularities of the past experiences. And this is something that's aimed directly at the heart of Descartes' Meditations. You can read Hume as sort of going along systematically showing that we really don't have proof of the logical necessity of just about anything. The example that he uses is the sun rising in the east tomorrow morning. And in chapter 10 of the Inquiry on Miracles, the other example that he uses is the rising of someone from the dead. Descartes defined knowledge as demonstrated probability of 1. What Descartes didn't want, because it just didn't meet his standard of knowledge, and if it were true, we wouldn't know anything, was that knowledge was probabilistic. That's exactly what David Hume says. It's not only is it exactly what David Hume says, that we only ever know knowledge to some degree of confirmation based on the comparative set of the habituating experiences. Right. He says that's all there. That's all there is. All right. So right. So we only ever know anything to to some probability. That's what Hume says. And if so the basic mistake, just to move on here, the first mistake, the most basic one that people make is they think that Hume just shares the criteria of knowledge of Descartes, and that Hume's showing, oh my gosh, we don't know anything, just like Descartes made exactly the same claim in the Meditations in the first place. But Hume doesn't think that at all. Hume thinks there's something dreadfully wrong with this hyper-rationalist view that says that we don't know anything. Hume's very influenced by Berkeley on this. Hume and Berkeley are both nominalists about the external world. That's an important point here. Let me talk about that. What we call the external world on this early empiricist view just is the set of all of our experiences. It just is the set of all of our experiences, right? To read this as a skeptical claim would be to say, a la Descartes, that perhaps we're stuck behind all of these experiences. These are our experiences, but they're personal and private to us. So we can't really make any inferences from those experiences. We're talking about basically phenomenal experiences of the external physical world in our bodies. We can't really say that we know anything about that. That's Descartes. Berkeley and Hume are saying, look, that set of experiences just is what the world is to you. And notice this gets, I'm not going to talk about it specifically at length here, but the problem of consciousness supposedly is that these phenomenal properties are somehow in the world, but we don't know how to integrate them into natural science. Empiricism properly understood, like Buddhism properly understood, shows that that's a pseudo problem. In this case, the phenomenal properties are the properties of my experience. They're not properties of the world. That is to say, if you think, well, we're going to talk about the common world in the last bullet point. Let's do it. The common world is the world we all share. It's not, it's an extra subjective world. This is a mistake, for example, that we're encouraged to make in movies like The Matrix, where the idea is, well, you're having this set of phenomenal experiences, but if you took the blue pill, then you'd have a different set of phenomenal experiences, as if somehow the set of phenomenal experiences you're having right now is somehow not accurate. But the set of phenomenal experiences you're having right now is just identical to what it is to be in your body. And it's, again, just an equivocation to say that we have a problem about where those experiences set in some sort of common external world. So nominalism, again, that's the key concept here, that what you've got is that when you're talking about what the external world is, really what you've got is a set of all of your experiences of the external world. And so Berkeley says this, and let me just actually step out, because lots of times people don't get Berkeley this way. You've got this Cartesian skeptical problem about the inner and the outer, about the mental and the physical, about the public and the private. And Berkeley comes along and he says, well, we're empiricists, right? And so our claim is that knowledge is based on experience. But you're wondering about the relationship between your experiences and something you're calling the external world. And Berkeley's approach, which is just formulaic, is to say, well, gosh, it looks like your speculation, your unwarranted metaphysical speculation is when you're talking about that external world of yours. I don't really see that. It looks like what you're experiencing or what you're calling mental representations. So why don't you just say that everything's mental? That's what Berkeley says. And Hume has the same position. He just takes the paradoxical language out of that. Okay, let me stop the share. Let me get back to the share. Okay. Okay, so here's the deal. I mean, it is a theory of learning, a theory of psychology. And on this empiricist model, everything is based on the empirical observations. You see at the bottom of that little loop there, a big set of experiences. And according to this sort of inductive model of science that we identify with Hume, it's that set of empirical experiences, the set of observations, the set of experiences, is really what's generating the generalizations. Again, empiricists will say some reasonable things. For example, that it looks like there are innate abilities, like Plato points out in the Meno. It looks like there are And Kant, of course, is the genius at this, at pointing out that, well, there have to be all sorts of things that are sort of prior to experience in order for experience to be possible. But the basic idea here is that as far as a generalization that we could use as the basis for a deductive inference, like Sherlock Holmes does, right? He knows the generalization, so he can look at the specific clue and make an inference about it. But that's all based originally, according to this empiricist model, on our learning from empirical experiences. So, as I say in the title of the slide here, Hume just, empiricism in general, I would say, just defines knowledge as the product of inductive inference, exactly what Descartes says knowledge cannot be. And so that basic distinction is one that's missed when we just lump Descartes and Hume together as co-skeptics. They're not. On this slide, then, I'm going to talk about a really specific reason why. Sometimes it's a more specific reason to Hume's theory of induction, and so it needs some explanation. Many readers, this is the first bullet point, including Audi in the epistemology textbook, say, well, you know, Hume points out that there's something called the problem of induction. So we put a name on it, the problem of induction. Now, this is supposedly a whole new category of skepticism, right? Like the problem of other minds and the dreaming problem and the brain in the vat and all that stuff. So anyway, this problem of induction on our list of types of skepticism. That's the idea. It's actually not a very good idea, but it is one that it's true that empiricists in particular have. That is, empiricists say that we produce knowledge by experience, but by definition, right? The future hasn't been experienced. So it looks like, according to the empiricist theory of knowledge production, it can't be that we have any knowledge about the future. But taken that way, I think that's quite misleading and not what Hume had in mind. Experience is open-ended. This is what Hume says. He says it right from the beginning. He doesn't add in anything when he formulates it as the problem of induction. Experience is open-ended. Knowledge is probabilistic. That's all the problem of induction codifies, right? That knowledge is probabilistic. It's not a further reason to think, well, we don't know anything, further than the reasons that Descartes has already given us. And, you know, again, the empiricist, certainly David Hume, you know, he doesn't think that knowledge formation is rational like a rationalist. He thinks we're conditioned by our experiences. So again, last bullet point. Codification of the model already presented by Hume. Problem of induction, just another way of describing this inductive inferential model of knowledge production that empiricism just is. You know, philosophy is really about the use of this word knowledge, right? And so I think one reason why people get confused about Hume and think that he's a skeptic is, you know, you can talk about knowledge in that Cartesian sense, but that's an equivocation. If one assumes like Descartes, then we don't know anything at all. Hume says that's a problem with Descartes' theory, not with conventional usage. If the theory turns out that I don't know anything, I don't go, oh, wow, man, I don't know anything. Hume's response isn't like that at all. He's not that kind of a personality. He says, no, man, we do know lots of stuff. It's the same problem with ethics, right? You say, well, maybe there's no such thing as ethics. And you say, well, I certainly spend an awful lot of time during the day talking about these things. So I guess there is such a thing. What is it? It's me spending all that time all day talking about these things. And knowledge is like ethics that way. You can say, well, there's no such thing as knowledge. Well, then I'll have to say schmowledge. So if you don't allow me to say ethics, I'll say schmethics because I'm going to have to say something. Hume is a cognitivist about knowledge production. Okay. Well, in fact, let me just step out just to put the point on that. You know, in terms of ethics, you know, we call Hume a non-cognitivist. What does that mean? It means that he doesn't think that ethical reasoning is a kind of logical reasoning, like, for example, the rationalist ethicist Kant does, who says that you make the generalization from the standpoint of a generic rational being. That's a logical exercise. Hume says we have a moral sentiment. He knows not why. It's an endowment of nature. And so then a normally functioning person, the psychopath is the exception that proves the rule, will have these feelings of benevolence and altruism and so on. It's non-cognitive And so Hume says epistemology is like that too. We are habituated by regularities of our experience to form expectations about the future. You say, well, you can't prove that. He says, no, I know. It's a treatise of human nature. It's an inquiry concerning human understanding. This is the way that we learn things. We learn things through repetition. We become conditioned to expect things. And like Kant, after him, getting it, I think, from Hume, Hume's going to say, when you talk about stuff beyond that, that's really unwarranted speculation. I think the radical thing about the empiricists, certainly about Berkeley and Hume, is that they think that, really this is the end of the story, that everything is somehow made out of these experiences. Okay. So now here's part of the reason why this is so important, because people don't get it, that empiricism actually not only is an alternative to the skepticism of the rationalist tradition. Empiricism does a lot more than that. Empiricism critiques the notion of mental representation altogether. The idea that what perception is the formation of a mental representation. That's probably, I think, certainly at the beginning of the 21st century, the most important thing about the empiricist tradition. And of course, notice that when we talk about classical skepticism, it's just a product of that Cartesian condition. The notion that there's the object and the subject. You've got the external object, and then you've got the mental representation of the object and the subject. And that then has baked into it that question mark of skepticism. Well, what's the relationship between the representation and the object that's out there outside of the body? It's missing maybe the most important part of the empiricist tradition, to see that it's a critique of that kind of reasoning, that skeptical Cartesian reasoning. It shows that it's a pseudo problem. Second bullet point. Berkeley and Hume deny that anything other than experiences can be appealed to as evidence for anything. That's what I was just saying a second ago. This basic empiricist principle denies the Cartesian possibility that things might not be what they seem. What they seem, in that sense, right, in terms of my phenomenal experience of the world, that's the thing that couldn't really coherently be replaced by some other phenomenal experience of the world, and somehow the true one. And notice people also will make a mistake if they think, well, maybe something tastes differently to me than it does to somebody else, and therefore neither one of us really knows what it tastes like. Again, see, that's a Cartesian illusion, that there's some real taste to it outside of one's own body, such that I can't say that I really know what spaghetti sauce tastes like. Indeed, I can exactly say I know what spaghetti sauce tastes like. Let's think about William James, the third bullet point. William James, again, notices what's significant here when William James says that the reason that we believe things is because there's a lot of utility value to believing it. What is that really a far out thing to say? Not really. James is saying there's trial and error, and we get positively reinforced, right? Where else could utility be, right? Then that's going to move your belief to fixation. And a lot of negative reinforcement is going to drive you away. It's really as simple as that when he talks about utility. So, it's a pragmatist theory of truth, of what it is that makes the proposition true, according to James. That's the way he frames it. And James says, what makes it true is its utility value. Notice the traditional notion is that what makes the belief true is that it corresponds to reality, a correspondence theory of truth. And James's pragmatist theory of truth then is not a representational theory. The correspondence theory of truth is the view that you've got a representation and it either succeeds or does not in corresponding to reality somehow. That supposed God's eye picture of reality that doesn't really exist. Okay, and James doesn't have any of that at all. James isn't, on James's view, what we're doing when we form beliefs and theories isn't trying to describe or construct a picture of the world. We've got our own pragmatic utilities that we need to see to survive. And Wittgenstein thinks the same thing when he talks about form of life. Wittgenstein, the last bullet point there, you've got a mysterious, the way he does it, it's about metaphysically, you've got this mysterious property of meaning, the semantic properties of the propositions. They have meaning, they have truth values, they have logical relations, And so they're these metaphysical Platonic beasties. And Wittgenstein's a nominalist. He says there's everything that you've tried to do, all of the pragmatic aims that you're trying to accomplish by using the symbol, and the aggregate of all of those is what we mean by the meaning of the symbol, our conventional use, including of the words that we enunciate and so on. These are pragmatic conventions like tool use that exist outside of our body. On his view, finally, sort of, in some ways, Wittgenstein might be the apotheosis of this view, that there is no language or representation inside the body at all. Wittgenstein's great sort of behaviorist vision is that language and mind are all on the surface and there isn't an inner. Whatever you may think of that, it's a striking vision that's got all sorts of fruits, and we're looking at it here. Notice Wittgenstein is in this main line of empiricism from Berkeley and Hume through John Stuart Mill, William James in the 19th century. And that's part of the reason why it's important to understand that Hume is not a skeptic, because if you think that, then you're missing this whole line of empiricism. This is the empiricist response to skepticism. First bullet point on the slide. Wittgenstein's identification of meaning with function. He says, you got this one. What is meaning really? It's function. It doesn't really go that much farther than Hume. Hume had what is called often a verificationist criteria of meaning, that something was meaningful if you could specify the observations that would serve to confirm or disconfirm it. And again, that's pragmatic, it's operational. Operational is the word that we use for a lot of these empiricist, pragmatist, behaviorist kind of theories. Operational in as much as what you're going to use to judge, to confirm, is what you can observe. And again, that's where skepticism goes wrong. Because, second bullet point, there are pragmatic criteria. Let me just step out for a second. I ask you, well, do you know where your car keys are? And presumably, I've got some reason for asking you where your car keys are. And why? Well, because you might know where your car keys are, you might not. I want to know whether you know or not. I've got some reason for wanting to know whether you know or don't know where your car keys are. Notice you also might be wrong. You might think you know where they are, and it turns out that you don't. So there are all these pragmatics around my asking you, where are your car keys? Now thinking about, do you know that the external world exists? Do you know where your car keys are? Yes, no. What about, do you know the external world exists? How am I going to check that? Do I know? I don't know. Let me go see if whether I know the external world exists or not. And what happens if the answer is no? Does anything change? Well, isn't there some implication the external world does not exist? Does it some sort of mean something? And is it something I could be mistaken about? It doesn't look like it. So the basic empiricist critique of skepticism is that it's just kind of meaningless, because that's really it's about the use of language and a coherent use of language, as I say on the slide here. Let me get back to that. Last middle one. Do you know where your car keys are? Right. I have reason for asking. Last bullet point. There are no pragmatics about the existence of the external world. But nor are there about, are you dreaming right now? Or do other minds exist? It's an interesting one. I talk about this in other places. I think that in the Wittgenstein video, we get into this. So finally, the last sentence on that slide, then the right response to the skeptical challenge, in this case, the one doesn't know that the external world exists, say, is I neither know nor do I not know. It's not an appropriate use of the verb to know. As Hume says, in the first place, it's a parlor game. Wittgenstein agrees, uses exactly the same metaphor, says that the deck is rigged. The way the deck is rigged is you've raised up the criteria of knowledge illegitimately in the first place. Exactly. That's what Descartes did. Okay. So all right. Yeah, I wanted to make that kind of short and sweet. I think that's probably enough. It's important for a couple of reasons. It's important to do David Hume justice, but I think it's also really not understanding a really fundamental argument an empiricist argument is very important. I mean, again, if you're talking about cognitive science, for example, you're interested in representational theories of mind. So I think that this issue is very important, and you need to be able to explain why it is that Hume's not a skeptic in order to understand Hume. That's my claim. Trying to be as sort of blunt and straightforward about it as possible. Okay, I'll stop talking. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope we spark some conversation.